Narrative reading of Othello. Hypothesis. Oliver Parker's Othello challenges modern audiences to look themselves in the mirror by directly confronting them to reconsider who they associate with in the unchanged skeleton of the narrative and how that translates into their perceptions in and of contemporary society. Breaking walls and bridging gaps. Reality is, for your typical 21st century audience, 20 minutes into a very traditional adaptation of a Shakespeare play, the dialogue, the characters, the sheer anticipation culminated in waiting for some drama to unfold, can begin to become a bit boring. We as an audience constantly need and demand and crave a reason to care about the characters enough to give them the time of day just to recall their name or purpose. Unfortunately, that connection can be arduous to establish in a film based on such archaic and foreign language. However, when Iago suddenly glances up at us, not anyone else, just us, then we immediately remember Kenneth Branagh's Elias is Iago, and he's consumed by the dire desire to bring Othello to his downfall as a form of revenge for the rumor that he did his office. This is the power of breaking the fourth wall. Audiences pay attention, and best of all, they didn't even see it coming. The aforementioned juxtaposition between first and third person point of view was a particularly thought-provoking aspect of the narrative of Oliver Parker's 1995 reproduction of Othello. Parker sprinkled a number of soliloquies throughout the film, which served to animate the storyline whilst providing viewers with a strong sense of engagement and understanding into the thought process of the characters. When you compare these to the soliloquies in Stuart Burge's 1956 make of Othello, there is one blatant and impactful difference: breaking the fourth wall. The fourth wall is a theatrical expression which refers to the fact that, in any work of fiction, the characters are essentially unaware of the fact that they're fictional characters, or of the audience observing them. Breaking the fourth wall is when a character acknowledges their fictionality by either indirectly or directly addressing the audience. Burge's films feature the same soliloquies word for word as Parker's. However, the characters are essentially talking to themselves. Their eyes dart around every inch of the screen except right to the camera itself. Whereas Parker implies a much more direct confrontation to the audience. Iago in his soliloquies looks directly at the camera and thus speaks directly to the audience. As a device, this direct address is by no means new, but what exactly are the motivations for its use? Breaking the fourth wall creates an unmistakable emotional connection between the character and the audience. Shakespeare himself used occasional soliloquies to address his audience in plays such as Hamlet, Richard III, As You Like It, and Henry V. To Be or Not to Be, let's remember, is not directed at any of the characters in the great tragedy. It's directed squarely to us. We are invited through dramatic convention to see what a character is thinking, and thereby gaining insight into his motivations. Our sympathy for that character, our sense of knowing them and siding with them increases as a result. Even with a fictionalized character as hideous as Iago, who paints the most innocent characters such as Desdemona as a whore, who kills his own accomplice without a second thought, and who plays everyone in the film as a puppet for sport, we still tend to side with him and his travails against our own will. Literature, as a rule, trumps TV and cinema in its ability to showcase the interior of characters. The direct address, as employed by Oliver Parker through Kenneth Branagh, goes some way to bridging the gap, and in doing so, allows us to identify with a character. However, the choice to showcase only Iago's soliloquies through direct address, but not Othello's, could be described as a cynical move for the narrative on Oliver Parker's part. And this trend is becoming increasingly common in modern-day film and television. Iago is a character in the style of Frank Underwood, Walter White, or Tony Soprano, a middle-aged male anti-hero. As an audience, we're drawn to root for the success of Frank in House of Cards, for example, even though we know what he's doing is completely unethical and deplorable, just like the leading men in Breaking Bad and The Sopranos. However, the difference with Othello is that the direct address with Iago doesn't necessarily equate to our unjustified support for his character. Rather, it makes us view him as even more vile, and as such, we view Othello as more innocent and done wrong to. In doing so, Oliver Parker heightens the tragic hero narrative he's been developing throughout the film by giving the audience these opportunities to interact one on one with the most vile of his characters, and therefore empathize more with his victims. Happily Never After. Another fundamental aspect to the narrative of this film is the three-act structure, which maps the change in character throughout the film. This structure was initially developed by Christopher Vogler, a film theorist who studied the journey of the hero in countless films, and we can apply his structure to Othello, often referred to as a tragic hero. Essentially, a character arc is a transformation or inner journey of a character over the course of a story. If a story has a character arc, the character begins as one sort of person and gradually transforms into a different sort of person in response to changing developments in the story. The mise en scene of the first scene in the film is pivotal to founding the initial character identification of Othello as the protagonist. This scene begins with a direct confrontation between Othello, Desdemona's newlywed husband, and Brabantio, in which the composition of Othello as he stands significantly in front of his accomplices sets the tone that he is a character very much in command of others and quite literally symbolizes that he's a step ahead of the rest. In fact, Othello is the first of the men to pull out his sword in this scene, quickly mimicked by Iago and Michael Cassio behind him. This domino effect emphasizes that men follow in Othello's footsteps, and as they stand in his shadow as sidekicks. Thus, Parker helps develop a strong sense of dominance in Othello's character, as one with the power to give orders rather than receive them. Moreover, as Parker directs the scene such that Othello unreservedly draws his sword on Brabantio, even going so far as to threaten him by leaving it lingering at his throat. This establishes the brave and powerful nature of his character, one who is self-confident and unintimidated by others, thus not easily swayed or bullied. Then, in the courtroom scene where Othello is demanded to explain his relationship with Desdemona, there are a number of tracking shots that follow him around the large room as he confidently lays out his case to the Duke, one which he presents by speaking loud and clear, with both articulation and strong conviction. The way in which these shots follow Othello establishes authority and control over his surroundings, but moreover, the presentation of Lawrence Fishburne's dialogue solidifies to the audience that Othello is intellectual and very assured. Establishing these character traits through various film elements is vital to developing the tragic hero narrative of Othello because it sets the background for a transformation in the character's nature. Within the first 15 minutes of the film, the audience also encounters multiple shots focused on Othello and Desdemona together. The integration of these shots throughout the infancy of the film are used by Parker to help the audience identify the weakness of Othello's character. Each of these shots have the same characteristics: warm lighting, close-up frames, and extremely proximate physical composition of the pair, who are often even depicted as touching and kissing. Cumulatively, these establish an unmistakable intimacy and romance between the two. These shots are edited in stark contrast to the dimly lit scenes where Brabantio and Othello clash, which are often predominantly filmed in more distance frames that allow us to see the entirety of the actors in the screen. Effectively, this shows that Othello has another side to him, one that is gentle, soft, and intimate, completely contrary to the dominant military character he adopts when interacting with others. This insight leads to the first punctuation in the character development arc, recognizing the weakness of the protagonist. It's immediately clear to both the viewers and the antagonist that Othello has one charming trait which also doubles as an inherent flaw: his love for Desdemona, which appears to know no ends. Iago is quick to latch onto this vulnerability in the otherwise strong and powerful military character of Othello, and creates a plot to convince Othello that his beloved wife is committing adultery with Michael Cassio. By the midpoint of the film, Iago has been successful in planting the seed of suspicion into Othello's mind, causing him to distort his outlook from one where he was willing to put all his trust into Desdemona and swiftly reject any accusation of her supposed unfaithfulness, to one where he readily tasks Iago, who he believed to be his confidant, to prove that she had indeed committed adultery. This marks a vital transition in the protagonist from being a man who was sure of himself and his relationship to one racked with insecurity and clouded with doubt. There is a noticeable decrease in intimate scenes with Othello and an increase in scenes where he converses in the darkness with Iago or spies upon Cassio and his wife, all of which feature the same gloomy nighttime setting, characterized by dim light and rugged props. These are a visual representation of Othello's descent as a character, and his now dark frame of mind corrupted by jealous, angry, and violent thoughts. Also, they show his increasing detachment from Desdemona, as the characters are not composed intimately. In fact, for a large chunk of the film, they are hardly even seen together at all. Oliver Parker then ensued the third section of this character development arc, central to the narrative of Othello. The protagonist chases the antagonist. This is where the idea of a tragic downfall, characteristic of Shakespeare's plays, shines right through. In most films, particularly around the time of this adaptation of Othello was made, this is often a section of self-realization and a harsh wake-up call to reality, one where the protagonist realizes he's being played and chases the antagonist. However, in Othello chases the wrong antagonist, which leads precisely to the unhappy ending that no one wants to anticipate. This is very much a striking racial message as much as it is part of the narrative of the film. This whole notion of the black man being set up and manipulated by the white man is what brings about his state of fear, jealousy, and doubt that are eventually so amplified that he's driven to murder the woman that he loves more than anything. Which begs the question, who is to blame? In Othello, we as an audience quickly jump to the conclusion that Iago is the master puppeteer of this whole plot and is the ultimate villain, yet we rarely see this mentality translate into reality. Fact. Black people represent 13% of the US population, while white people constitute roughly 77%. There are more black men in state prisons across the nation than there are white men, and in over one-fifth of the American states, black men compose over half of the prison population. Surely it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that when African American incarceration rates are 5 times higher than those of whites, the system is flawed. No doubt, when we've got more black American males in prison than there are enrolled in colleges and universities, then surely there must be a cause behind this overrepresentation of minorities. This imbalance is so blatant and the racial disparity so undeniable that it should be unignorable, but it isn't. Why do we as a society continue to refuse the reality shown in Othello that the criminal is often driven to criminal behavior by someone or something else? What type of people are we for backing a justice system that continues to endorse injustice with implicit racial biases? Most importantly, when we're willing to sit by and watch a system that systematically targets minorities, one where a black man who's caught doing drugs, that mind you, he's often resorted to out of desperation and because he's been brought up in that cycle of poverty, can receive a life sentence rather than rehabilitation, while a white man committing millions of dollars of tax fraud, a crime that goes on to affect countless other people, can get off with plea bargains and bails. If we watch this situation replay itself day to day, yet act as mere bystanders each time, then who is the real criminal? Such a piercing message is sent when we see the color fade from Othello's face after he kills Desdemona, and realizes he was manipulated into doing so through the alternate reality painted by Iago. At the end of the narrative, we see not only a newly transformed protagonist, but rather one that ceases to exist. This negative character development arc throughout the film shows the director trying to convey that perhaps the unhappy endings leave us feeling queasy because we're contributing to them, and because it isn't all just a film that can fade away from our memories like a dream. Unhappy endings are the reality for many minorities facing unjust discrimination in society, and they should leave us feeling guilty. Intended reading. Hypothesis. Oliver Parker's Othello epitomizes the positive strides contemporary society has made in terms of race relations, and yet highlights how far we've got left to go in order to bridge the gap between black and white individuals and communities in all facets of life. Times change, people change. Even today, the motion picture has not quite outgrown its immaturity. It still uses talented Negro players to fit into the stereotypes of the loving mammy and the comic servant. That's if it uses them at all. This quote by Edith J.R. Isaac is a piercing epitome of the racial representation, or lack of, in film fare throughout the last century. As a modern Western society, we often take pride in the perception of being a cultural melting pot. However, for many minorities, this image of harmonious acceptance and existence starkly differs from their everyday experiences. Historically, the media has often failed to represent and accurately portray minorities, and every single film thrown into the mix has the power to either contribute to this damaging trend or abolish it. It's a shame that for decades the only times we've seen black people make it onto our screens is when they're reported for crimes. Oliver Parker's character casting in Othello sought to change that reality and add a new shade to our entertainment palette while offering a new dimension to our understanding of minorities in society. Parker's 1995 adaptation of Othello was the first cinematic reproduction of the play released by a major studio, Castle Rock Entertainment and Columbia Pictures, to cast an African American, Lawrence Fishburne, to play the role of Othello, a character directly referenced as the Moor in the original play, which implies his African or Arab heritage, either way, determining him as a man of color. Although previous low-budget independent films starring Ted Lange and Yaphet Kotto predated Oliver Parker's film in casting a black man for the role of Othello, the only other major cinematic production before its time was Stuart Burgess' Othello, which casted Laurence Olivier, a white man in blackface, as Othello. Blackface was a theatrical form of makeup that gained popularity during the 19th century, with directors who used it to create a sense of authenticity to the character of Othello and his Moorish heritage, even when played by actors of European descent. This was seen in countless renditions of the play, including the 1952, 56, 65, and 86 remakes, which are just a few of the many produced throughout the former half of the 20th century. Naturally, media portrayals of minority characters often tend to represent mainstream attitudes towards minorities, and as such, they act as a byproduct of the racial construct of their time. Oliver Parker's bold move to accurately represent Othello signaled an important shift towards progressive race relations in Hollywood and among contemporary audiences at the turn of the 20th century. Most importantly, for a film based on the ultimate downfall of a black man, this casting choice simultaneously symbolized the ascent of blacks in modern society. The Venetian society in which Othello was based was blatantly racist. In fact, Desdemona was a rare exception in this whitewashed world where Moors in Venice were far and few due to the minimal migration of Africans and Middle Easterners to Europe in the 16th century context of Othello. If you strip down Othello as a narrative enough, you could read it as one where society harbors an all-exclusive, blacks are barbarians frame of mind, except for the ones who serve in the military, where those barbaric qualities are of advantage. We see these blacks as being exceptional, but not the normal. The unfortunate reality being that blacks are uncredible on a whole and sit at the bottom of the racially constructed hierarchy of society. But when Oliver Parker cast Lawrence Fishburne as Othello, he sent the message that even when black individuals are the ones who ultimately lose out in the world we live in, things are changing. To give a black man the opportunity to play a black character is to give him the tools to make something of himself, and the opportunity to redefine what a black man is. Moreover, it allows him to tell the narrative of what it means to be a black man in a world where most of the power undeniably lies within white hands, from an authentic source. It shows that the expectations of audiences today are changing. It would be insulting to the majority, black or white, if another adaptation of Othello was made today with a white man in blackface playing Othello. Oliver Parker shows that although Othello was led by his downfall by a white man, we don't have to keep contributing to the downfall of minorities in our society. There are opportunities everywhere, if only we push ourselves to seize them. Oliver Parker used his power to cast a black man as Othello as his tool for change. What will be your tool? Even now, over 2 decades on from the debut of Oliver Parker's Othello, race representation remains a topic of major controversy among media circles, but particularly in Hollywood, which is actively criticized for being Eurocentric even in today's multicultural age. The film industry has come an undeniably long way from the days where Laurence Olivier playing blackface Othello went praised rather than questioned, to the present in which films even as widely spanning as Prince of Persia, The Social Network, and Pan have been slammed for casting white actors in inherently ethnic roles. Today, blackface is almost universally frowned upon, and it's become a staple for celebrities of all walks to stand up against racial bias, whether that be actors such as Lupita Nyong'o or George Clooney, musicians such as Kanye West and Rihanna, or even models such as Tyra Banks. Parker's 1995 adaptation was a film that contributed to normalizing a more culturally diverse and inclusive media workforce, and endorsing a notion of acceptance and encouragement directed at minorities, particularly Africans holding positions of power and influence. The casting of Lawrence Fishburne as Led in Othello indicated a movement towards more fair and accurate representation within Hollywood and general Western media, but also particularly for the world of Shakespeare, which till then had been largely racially exclusive to male white actors. While there's always room for improvement, Parker's Othello is a reflection of the growth in contemporary racial tolerance and was one of the many films that has paved a path of opportunity for black men in the film industry and the foundation on which black actors such as Eddie Murphy, Kevin Hart, and Will Smith are among now considered appealing to the masses and profitable. However, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at recent lists of highest paid actors, where are the people of color? There is one anomaly on that list. Dwayne Johnson, who is of black and Samoan descent and was able to command a huge $64.5 million in 2016. However, look at the lower end of the totem pole, and a pattern immediately emerges. Proportionately few of these actors are non-white, and for most of those who are minorities and have earned critical acclaim for their roles, oddly, their pay doesn't seem to commensurate with their cultural impact or even exist at par with their white counterparts. In 2014, it was revealed that Jennifer Lawrence was paid way less than her male co-stars for American Hustle, courtesy of the Sony hack, and that grew worldwide headlines. A year later, she wrote about the incident, and that gained worldwide headlines too. What didn't get as many column inches is Chris Rock saying that had Lawrence been black, she would have been paid even less. What a tragedy. But in all seriousness, throughout the 20th century, minorities have made significant strides towards autonomy and equality in American society. From the right to own land to the right to vote, and further still, the squelching of Jim Crow era segregation in the South. These advances are part of the American identity. Yet it seems that they've not fully infiltrated the collective whole of American society's media. Despite the political rights and power that minorities have obtained, the supremacist ideologies and racist beliefs that were indoctrinated into the American psyche are just recently being reversed. However, these ideas that were ingrained in the mindset of Americans for so long have given way to a less conscious variant of segregation. No longer is it the blatant practice upheld by the law and celebrated with hangings and beatings, but instead it's a subtle practice that is the crown jewel of the entertainment, media, and film industries. We might not see Confederate flags flying in parks or signs relegating colored people to separate facilities, but we do see minorities cast as criminals and leeches to upper class America. It is the Paramount Pictures, NBCs, ABCs, and Universal Studios of the world that are propagators of the negative stereotypes and inescapable stigmas that many thought were left behind once the shackles of segregation were broken. Unfortunately, they are resurfacing in our sitcoms, newscasts, and big screen movies. Historically, the portrayal of minorities in movies and television is less than ideal. Whether it's appearing in disparaging roles or not appearing at all, minorities are the victims of an industry that relies on old ideas to appeal to the majority at the expense of the insignificant minority. We cannot contribute to this vicious cycle that is the unconscious racism of the media. Instead, we need to break the cycle and formulate a new industry that is more representative of the reality that Western and global society is today. That change starts with directors like Oliver Parker casting colored men like Lawrence Fishburne in roles such as Othello, which open our eyes as an audience to the reality that racist roots in this old age are still embedded in today's society, and our job isn't over until they're all weeded out. O.J. Simpson, the Othello of our time. Lastly, when considering the messages hidden in Oliver Parker's Othello, one simply cannot ignore the question, why this story specifically? And why was it worth reproducing in 1995? Directors often produce film renditions of classic stories for a variety of reasons. These films are born with marketing advantages, courtesy of the already well established fan bases which exist around the franchise. And what's more, they're relatively cheap because they come with reference points and general concepts already built in. A win win. A modern remake of a classic story can be a real crowd pleaser and a moneymaker, and films such as 10 Things I Hate About You was a modern retelling of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, stands as testament to this notion that, if executed right, remakes can be used as a tool to bring new meaning and relevance to old context, or to educate audiences. However, Parker's Othello slipped between all these typical cracks. Parker was unique in that he didn't fiddle with the original content of the play and strayed true to the time honored plot and dialogue of Shakespeare's text. In a time where audiences globally were already spoilt for entertainment choices, it had to be more than just a mere coincidence that the Castle Rock Entertainment and Columbia Pictures invested US $11 million into this remake of the classic that younger audiences particularly had little knowledge and understanding or interest of. The surface this film brought no new selling point with an absence of any famous featured actors, so it's easy enough to deem it a film which turned up without reason or rhyme, but the answer is hidden in plain sight. O.J. Simpson, the Othello of our times. The similarities will seize you by the throat. It was not a coincidence that Oliver Parker's cinematic reproduction of Othello wound up on the big screen the very same year that the O.J. Simpson murder case took the world by storm. Once known as the most famous running backs in football history, O.J. Simpson's reason for renown changed forever on June 12, 1994. On that day, Simpson's ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman were found stabbed to death at her Los Angeles condominium. Simpson was charged with the murders, but acquitted all of the criminal charges in a televised case that fixated the nation. The controversy around this murder trial garnered international interest and ultimate media attention. In fact, on October 3rd, 1995, the trial of the century ended with Simpson's acquittal, with 150 million people turning in for the verdict, making it one of the most watched events in television history. This immense fascination with the murder case consumed the American public, and it's safely conceivable that Oliver Parker saw this opportunity to capitalize on O.J. Simpson's story, which shared remarkable characteristics to those of Othello, a tragic black hero. In Parker's Othello, we are presented with a warrior who, on the surface, radiates impeccable grace, courage, and power, but yet is tragically manipulated to descend into the pits of jealousy and insecurity, and a character who ultimately murders his own wife, who he supposedly loved unconditionally. Simultaneously, in 1995, the whole world bore televised witness to an athlete of equally impeccable public grace, courage in the light of heinous criminal accusations, and a character who, everyone but the jury agrees, murdered his ex-wife. Othello, a Moorish general in the Venetian army, was illegitimately married to a beautiful, fair-skinned Venetian woman, who was considerably younger than he was, as implied in the line, "An old black ram is topping your white ewe," which refers to Othello and Desdemona respectively. In time, he grew violently jealous, and an underlying weakness of his character, for one who had earned such noble and strong reputation. O.J., a Hall of Fame running back, was also married to a beautiful, fair-skinned woman named Nicole Brown Simpson, who was of German descent and 12 years younger than him. And like Othello, he had grown progressively jealous and abusive over the years, a shocking weakness of a character for one who was universally perceived as an inspiration and heroic, particularly to America's African-American community. The interracial nature of both relationships are a blatant similarity between Othello and O.J. Othello was shunned in Venetian society for marrying Desdemona, who Brabantio believed Othello had enchanted into the relationship. OJ and Nicole didn't face discrimination as directly. However, among the black community, particularly black women who were often reserved to the idea of black men marrying out of the community, their relationship is also a note of controversy. Overall, though, it's certainly not a dispute in the eyes of most Americans who had become accustomed to diversity in partnerships. Then came murder. As depicted in a heartbreaking scene, monstrously afraid he was being made the fool, Othello strangled the fair Desdemona in a premeditated fashion. Then, after the murder, in a sudden desperate awareness of his own emotional fragility and his doomed reputation, he impaled himself with a dagger. In another eerie parallel to the famous tragedy, after being charged with the brutal murders of his ex-wife and a man with whom she was sleeping, O.J. Simpson held the barrel of a gun to his skull while driving back and forth down the main highway and threatened to do the same deed. The central difference between the narrative of Othello's downfall and that of O.J. Simpson's was that, despite being of the same race, African, as Othello was a Moor and O.J. was a black of African American descent, their treatment in society was radically different. The black burden both men shared within their respective societies was not an equal one. What one must recognize when comparing the two is that both men were minorities of minorities. Few black men in Venetian society had the power and authority that Othello had as a military general, and similarly, few black men had celebrity status in the contemporary United States in which O.J. Simpson was hailed. Aside from sports stars, there were far fewer black public figures in politics or in media compared to the white majority. As such, both Othello and O.J. were able to transcend elements of racism more than others in society, which allowed them to succeed. However, the extent to which they were able to do so was also very different. Othello was celebrated as a military commander. However, outside these ranks, people had heavily negative perceptions about him. Brabantio, Desdemona's father, rejected him as a partner for his daughter, simply based on his race, and jumped to quick conclusions about the ill deeds Othello would have committed to convince Desdemona to marry him. Both Iago and Rodrigo consistently referred to him in demeaning terms, often drawing parallels between him as a black man and animals such as horses, as if he were a savage. Even the mere fact that the only powerful character of color in this film is a military commander in charge of war, which in itself is often thought of as barbaric and dangerous because of the potential risk taken upon a soldier's life, shows that Othello's life as a black man was considered to be more expendable than a white man's life, and that black men were barred from succeeding in other fields in Venetian society. Throughout the film, Parker focuses on the internalized racism that Othello also harbored, as he was aware that he was regarded in a lesser light to his white counterparts in society. This was shown in three scenes. Scene 3, Handkerchief Accusation, where Othello mourns, "Haply, for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation," when he suspects Desdemona committed adultery, and was drawn to do so because he was black and unable to provide the same finesse and sophistication characteristic of a white man. On the latter, Simpson was not only admired by society for his sporting success, but he was regarded of equal status to those of a non-white background also within the liberal social circles of the affluent in San Francisco. Unlike Othello's illegitimate marriage, that of O.J. Simpson and Nicole did not cause any dispute or raise eyebrows among the majority of American society, where interracial marriage was becoming increasingly common. Moreover, whilst Othello ended up committing suicide from the sheer guilt he felt after murdering his wife, O.J. Simpson was able to use his fame and wealth to essentially bail his way out of a guilty verdict. The LAPD investigative team, led by Marcia Clark, had what many would consider indisputable DNA evidence of Simpson's involvement. However, represented by a portfolio of elite lawyers including Robert Shapiro and Johnny Cochran, O.J. Simpson managed to walk away completely free of charge from the murder trial, despite an astounding majority of the American public perceiving him as guilty. Similarly, Othello was never able to escape the racism that fueled Venetian society. Despite O.J. ultimately having been able to exploit the pedestal on which he stood in society, this contrast in the otherwise almost identical narrative between Othello, who was represented as a powerful anomaly of black man in Venetian society, and O.J. Simpson, who was one of the few famous and wealthy black men in contemporary American society, showed that for successful black men, things have entirely changed. These men now have the same power as many of their white counterparts who once used to abuse them in the same position. However, one of the main reasons this case blew up so much was because it was abnormal. Society wasn't conditioned to see a black man in power exploiting his power in contrast to a white man for a change. This is a reflection of contemporary society, where the reality is that for the average black man, race relations haven't progressed significantly. The O.J. Simpson case created a huge avenue for conversations about the treatment of black men, and particularly powerful black men, in society, and this is precisely the same narrative of Othello. Oliver Parker, by screening this film barely 2 months after O.J. Simpson's trial had finished, cleverly sent a message to society to look itself in the mirror. Frankly, following all the empowering 1916 civil rights movement to end racial segregation and discrimination in America, and as the world began to globalize at a much greater rate due to technological developments, at the turn of the 20th century, there was certainly a sense that the world had come a long way in terms of race relations. Yet, although this narrative is fictitious, the main cultural tensions that it's founded upon are just as real today as they were 400 years ago in Venetian society. This narrative challenges the mindset that our society is widely disparate from those of the past and shows that many of the race relative issues they faced are ones that are still present today under a different guise. Donald Trump, the most powerful man in the world, based his campaign rhetoric hugely on attacking minorities. Our jobs are being taken like candy from a baby. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. The media hounded him for this, yet he still won, which means that inevitably there are elements of these racist streaks that people still today associate with, but they do so quietly. Everyone saw diehard supporters of Trump challenging loyal supporters of Clinton, but the polls right till Election Day indicated that the previous First Lady had the position in the bag, which shows that things are not what they seem and people are feeding off racism more subtly than ever before, perhaps making it harder to recognize and eradicate than it ever has been. Moreover, the fact that Trump was able to pave his way to power by feeding off these racial fears somewhat sends a message that it's okay to be racist again, and categorize whole races of individuals based on prescribed traits, which at best only apply to a few. This is unbelievably similar to the tactics adopted by Adolf Hitler, who is perceived as an embodiment of evil and all that we refuse to support and mimic, yet we continue to witness history unfold itself, just like O.J. mirrored Othello. Perhaps our society is moving backwards rather than forwards in this aspect. But this film showed that the events of the past are far from distant and we are still popping up in different forms, essentially stating out the obvious, that our work is far from done. But more than that, we can learn a lot from the past going into the future, and not to deem that negligible. Race relations have improved vastly for the majority of blacks in positions of power and fame. However, the average black man is still often a victim of the harsh judgments and prejudices of our society. Conclusion. Ultimately, some things never change, but Shakespeare's play, like a fine wine, seem to only get better with age. The subjects he wrote about, love, ambition, power, greed, betrayal, are also intrinsically ingrained in our human nature, that centuries on, they still uphold their grand status of being relatable to every coming generation. They're universal. Even if his language comes across as archaic and increasingly difficult to decipher over time, ultimately, the meaning and depth behind his words remain as modern as ever. His stories don't just put a scenario before the audience and let it play out, but they constantly challenge the observer to think about right and wrong, and how to navigate the vast gray regions in between. Oliver Parker managed to capture the same essence through his masterful mix of narrative and race-related intentions, which encouraged us as an audience to appreciate how far we've come as a society that prides itself as being more than just black and white, but still reflect on how much we embody the traits we praise ourselves in condemning. Our road is long and winding, full of obstacles still, but there is light at the end of the road, if only we strive to reach it.